The year is 1971. A South Korean airliner, hijacked mid-flight, is forced toward the North Korean border. Its captain a hostage, its fate uncertain. This is not just a story of a single hijacking, but a glimpse into the decades-long conflict dividing the Korean peninsula, where the border is a front line and even the skies are a battleground. During the Cold War, North Korea orchestrated a chilling campaign of kidnappings, targeting South Koreans, foreign nationals, and even entire airliners, all to serve the regime's ambitions. These abductions were calculated, serving propaganda and strategic goals, and the hijackings we'll explore were among the most audacious acts in this shadow war. In 1969, South Korean air travel was shockingly lax. No metal detectors, no real security, just trust. That trust was shattered when a routine domestic flight was hijacked mid-air, turning a short trip into an international crisis. South Korea, focused on economic growth, believed the North's threat was distant, until a hijacker exposed just how vulnerable the nation truly was. The YS-11 hijacking forced the country to confront a new reality. The enemy could strike anywhere, even from the next seat on a plane. On December 11, 1969, Cho Chang-hui boarded a flight like any other passenger, his weapon hidden, his intentions deadly. Minutes after takeoff, he stormed the cockpit, demanding the plane be flown to North Korea, plunging 51 souls into a geopolitical nightmare. Captain Yoo Byung-ha was a seasoned pilot, but nothing in his training could have prepared him for this moment. With a weapon aimed at him and his co-pilot, he was forced to make a life-or-death decision. The hijacker, Cho, stood menacingly behind them, his voice a constant, threatening presence in the small cockpit. He warned them explicitly against using the radio. Any signal, any distress call, any deviation from his command to fly north would be their last act. The captain understood the immense risk. A nervous hijacker was the most dangerous kind, and challenging him could lead to a bloodbath. The safety of the 49 other souls on board rested entirely on his shoulders. He had to suppress his own fear and project an aura of compliance to keep the situation from escalating. With a heavy heart, the captain surrendered control. He disengaged the planned flight path to Seoul and steered the aircraft northward, towards the demilitarized zone, the most heavily fortified border in the world. The plane became a silent vessel, cut off from the outside world, flying a rogue course into enemy territory. The passengers in the cabin would have started to notice the deviation. The flight was short, and the sun's position or the landscape below might have seemed wrong. A quiet unease would have begun to ripple through the cabin as the minutes ticked by, but they were unaware of the life and death drama unfolding just a few feet away in the cockpit. Their fate was being decided for them, without their knowledge or consent, by a man with a weapon and a political agenda. The journey was agonizingly tense. Every minute that passed brought them closer to North Korean airspace, a point of no return. The pilots had to maintain the delicate balance of obeying the hijacker's orders while hoping for some form of intervention. They were flying blind, metaphorically speaking, unable to communicate their plight. The hijacker remained vigilant, watching their every move, ensuring they did not touch the communication dials. The pilots could only exchange worried glances, their shared predicament creating a silent bond of understanding. They were professionals caught in an impossible situation, forced to use their skills to facilitate a crime they were desperate to prevent. The hum of the engines was the only sound that broke the suffocating tension in the cockpit. Meanwhile, on the ground, the lack of communication was beginning to raise alarms. Air traffic controllers in Seoul expected the YS-11 to check in as it approached their airspace. When the plane failed to make contact and disappeared from its expected route on their radar screens, concern quickly turned to alarm. A plane simply does not vanish from the sky without a trace. The controllers tried repeatedly to establish radio contact, their calls echoing into an empty, unresponsive void. The silence from the YS-11 was deafening. It was a clear sign that something was terribly wrong. The aircraft was now flying a straight, unwavering line directly towards North Korea, a flight path no sane pilot would ever take willingly. The South Korean military was immediately alerted. The detection of a civilian airliner flying a direct, unauthorized course toward North Korea triggered the highest level of alert within the South Korean Air Force. This was a scenario they trained for. A potential defection, or worse, a provocation that could spark a wider conflict. Within minutes, 2 F-5 fighter jets were scrambled from a nearby airbase, their engines roaring as they streaked into the sky. Their mission was clear: intercept the rogue airliner, determine the nature of the threat, and force it to turn back before it crossed the demilitarized zone. The fate of the 51 people on board now depended not only on the pilots in the cockpit, but also on the military pilots racing to catch them. The sky over the Korean peninsula had become a theater for a high-stakes confrontation. The fighter jets, vastly faster than the turboprop YS-11, closed the distance rapidly. They fell into formation on either side of the passenger plane, their sleek, deadly frames a stark contrast to the civilian aircraft. The military pilots tried to establish radio contact, their calls crackling over the emergency frequencies, ordering the YS-11 to immediately alter its course. But just as with the air traffic controllers, their calls were met with silence. The military pilots moved closer, flying wing to wing with the airliner, trying to peer into the windows to assess the situation inside. What they saw confirmed their worst fears. The faces of the passengers pressed against the windows were masks of terror and panic, their hands gesturing frantically, pleading for help. One of the fighter pilots maneuvered his jet with incredible skill, bringing it close enough to get a clear view of the YS-11's cockpit. He looked for a sign from the captain, a signal that could explain the bizarre and dangerous flight path. He tried to communicate directly with Captain Yu, using hand signals and radio calls, demanding that he turn the plane around. The captain's response was heartbreaking. He could not speak, but his expression was one of pure anguish. He looked at the fighter pilot and slowly, deliberately, shook his head. It was a clear message: I can't. It was a gesture of helplessness, a desperate communication from a man who was no longer in command of his own aircraft. The military pilot knew then that this was no simple defection. The pilot's gaze then shifted past the captain, deeper into the cockpit. He saw the silhouette of another person standing behind the flight crew. The figure appeared to be holding something, an object pointed at the pilots' heads. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This was a hijacking. The captain was not a traitor, he was a hostage. The military pilot immediately relayed his assessment back to the command center on the ground. The civilian plane was not defecting, it was being forcibly taken to North Korea. The situation had just become infinitely more complex and dangerous. The lives of everyone on board were hanging by a thread, and the options for a safe resolution were rapidly disappearing. The report from the fighter pilot created confusion and debate back at the Air Force Command Center. The initial assumption had been a defection, a scenario for which they had protocols. A hijacking, however, was a different and more delicate matter. Some in command were skeptical, clinging to the idea that the captain and co-pilot were willingly flying to the north. The order that came back to the fighter pilot was chilling and absolute fire warning shots. If that failed, disable the aircraft. The command center believed forcing the plane down on South Korean soil, even at great risk, was preferable to allowing it to be used as a propaganda tool by the North. The pilot in the sky was now faced with an unthinkable command. He argued back, his voice strained with the gravity of the situation. "This is a civilian plane," he insisted over the radio. "I see a man with a gun in the cockpit. The plane is under hijack." He was trying to make them understand the reality of what he was witnessing, the terror on the passengers' faces, the captain's desperate plea. But the command center was running out of time. The YS-11 was just moments away from crossing the border. The order was revised, becoming even more specific and more horrifying: shoot one of the engines. The logic was that the YS-11, a twin-engine turboprop, could theoretically land with just one engine. It was a desperate gamble to force the plane down on their side of the line. The military pilot was stunned into disbelief. "How can you ask me to shoot at a civilian plane?" he radioed back, his conscience at war with his duty. The order was repeated, more urgently this time. "Execute the order. There's less than a minute before it crosses the border. Shoot now." The pilot's mind raced. He was a soldier, trained to follow orders without question. But he was also a human being. He knew that firing a cannon round into the engine of a passenger plane could have catastrophic consequences. The risk of a fuel tank explosion, a fire that would engulf the aircraft and doom everyone on board, was immense. He could be the one to kill all 51 people he was sent to save. In those final frantic seconds, the pilot hesitated. His finger was on the trigger, the YS-11 perfectly lined up in his sights. He could hear the insistent, frantic shouts of his commanders in his headset, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He could not take the risk of turning a hijacking into a massacre. His hesitation, born from a deep sense of morality and a refusal to sacrifice innocent lives, sealed the plane's fate. While he wrestled with his conscience, the YS-11 continued its inexorable flight north. The invisible line of the DMZ loomed ahead. The window of opportunity, the chance to intervene, was closing with every passing second. The pilot's moment of profound moral conflict had cost them the one thing they did not have: time. The moment of decision passed. The Korean Airlines YS-11, with its precious cargo of human lives, slipped across the aerial border and into North Korean airspace. As soon as the plane crossed the line, the mission for the South Korean fighter jets was over. To pursue the airliner would be an act of war, an invasion of sovereign airspace that could trigger a full-scale military retaliation from the north. With heavy hearts and a sense of profound failure, the two fighter pilots banked their jets sharply and turned back towards home base. They had been unable to prevent the hijacking, forced to watch as the civilian plane and its 51 occupants disappeared into enemy territory. They were the last friendly eyes to see the plane. For the passengers and crew aboard the YS-11, the retreat of the fighter jets signaled the end of all hope for an immediate rescue. They were now truly alone, flying deeper into the world's most isolated and secretive state. The hijacker, Cho Chang-hui, had succeeded. He had used the threat of violence and the institutional hesitation of his opponents to achieve his goal. The plane continued its journey for a short while longer before being guided to land at Sondok Airfield near the city of Wonsan, on North Korea's east coast. As the plane touched down, it was immediately surrounded by North Korean soldiers and officials. The ordeal in the sky was over, but a new and uncertain chapter of captivity was just beginning for everyone on board. The news of the successful hijacking spread like wildfire through the South Korean media. It was a national humiliation and a source of immense public anxiety. The government was heavily criticized for the security lapse that allowed the hijacking to happen, and for the military's failure to stop it. The story dominated headlines for months, a constant, painful reminder of the nation's vulnerability. Families of the passengers and crew gathered, desperate for any information, their grief and anger broadcast across the nation. The hijacking was not just a political incident, it was a deeply personal tragedy for dozens of families who were now at the mercy of the unpredictable regime in Pyongyang. North Korea, true to form, immediately began to spin the incident for its own propaganda purposes. They publicly denied that a hijacking had even occurred. Their official state media announced to the world that the two pilots, Captain Yoo Byung-ha and co-pilot Cho Seok-man, had heroically flown their plane to the north, defecting of their own free will to escape the living hell of the corrupt, American puppet South Korean regime. They presented the event as a triumph for their ideology, a testament to the superiority of their system that brave South Koreans would risk their lives to join. This blatant lie was their official story, a narrative designed to save face internationally and sow discord in the South. The truth of the gun in the cockpit was conveniently erased. While North Korea presented a story of voluntary defection to the outside world, it simultaneously crafted a different narrative aimed at the South Korean populace. They knew that news and rumors would inevitably leak back across the border. They began to circulate stories within North Korea, intended for a southern audience, that the hijacker Cho Chang-hui had been received as a national hero. The propaganda machine claimed he had been given a massive financial reward, with some reports mentioning a figure as high as $2 million. He was portrayed as a brave patriot who had performed a great service for the fatherland. This was almost certainly a fabrication, but its purpose was clear: to incentivize others to do the same. The message was a cynical and tempting form of psychological warfare. It was a broadcast to the disenfranchised, the poor, and the politically disaffected in South Korea. The North was effectively saying, "Look at what awaits you here. If you are brave enough to hijack a plane and bring it to us, you will not just be welcomed, you will be made rich and famous. You will be a hero." This was a key part of their broader strategy to encourage defections and destabilize their southern rival. By creating a myth around the hijacker, they hoped to inspire a new wave of copycat attacks, turning South Korea's own civilian infrastructure into a weapon against itself. The fate of the actual passengers was of secondary importance to this larger propaganda victory. Under intense international pressure and facing outrage at home, the South Korean government entered into tense negotiations with the North for the return of the passengers and crew. These talks were fraught with difficulty, as North Korea used the hostages as bargaining chips. Finally, after 2 long and agonizing months, an agreement was reached. On February 14, 1970, a handover was arranged at the Panmunjom Truce Village in the heart of the DMZ. In a carefully orchestrated event, 39 of the passengers were allowed to walk back across the border into South Korea. The reunions with their families were emotional and heartbreaking, captured in news footage that showed tearful embraces and the overwhelming relief of being home. But the relief was incomplete. The joy of the 39 returned was overshadowed by the sorrow for those left behind. The total number of people on the plane was 51. The hijacker, Cho Chang-hui, remained in the north, his fate ultimately unknown beyond the propaganda stories. But he was not the only one. North Korea refused to release 11 other people. These were not random individuals. The group included the entire flight crew, the captain, the co-pilot, and the 2 flight attendants, as well as 7 passengers, who possessed valuable skills. Among them were engineers, doctors, and company executives. North Korea had cherry-picked the human assets it wanted to keep, turning a hijacking into a calculated act of abduction. For these 11 people, their brief flight had become a life sentence. The joy that erupted at Panmunjom on February 14, 1970, was tragically incomplete, a fractured celebration tinged with profound sorrow. While 39 individuals walked across the bridge of no return to freedom, their steps were shadowed by the absence of those left behind. North Korea's decision to retain 11 of the abductees was a cruel and calculated move, a final painful twist in an already agonizing saga. The individuals they kept were not chosen at random. It was a strategic selection, a human harvest designed to benefit the isolated state. The regime in Pyongyang had assessed the manifest and identified those whose knowledge and skills were deemed too valuable to return. This act transformed the hijacking from a temporary hostage crisis into a permanent state-sanctioned kidnapping of skilled professionals. The list of the unreturned reads like a roster of a nation's intellectual capital. It included the 2 pilots, Captain Yu Byung-ha and co-pilot Cho Seok-man, whose aviation expertise was a prized commodity. The 2 flight attendants, Jong Jong-suk and the aforementioned Song Gyong-hui, were also held back, perhaps for propaganda purposes or to serve in other state-controlled roles. The remaining 7 passengers were a collection of highly skilled individuals, doctor, engineers, and prominent producers for a major broadcaster. North Korea saw them not as people with families and lives, but as assets to be exploited. They were to be forcibly integrated into the North Korean system, their talents repurposed to serve the needs of the regime that had stolen their freedom. For the families of these 11 people, the partial release was a new form of torture. Their hopes had been raised, only to be brutally dashed. They were forced to watch other families reunite, while their own loved ones remained captive in an enemy state with no official channel of communication. Their lives were thrown into a state of perpetual limbo, clinging to the faint hope that diplomatic efforts might one day bring their relatives home. The South Korean government continued to protest and demand their release, but their calls fell on deaf ears. The 11 abductees of the YS-11 became a permanent fixture in the tragic history of divided families, a symbol of North Korea's utter disregard for human rights and international norms. The fate of these 11 individuals serves as a grim and haunting postscript to the hijacking. They were effectively erased from their old lives, and forced to build new ones under the watchful eye of the totalitarian state. They would marry, have children, and grow old in a land that was not their own, forever severed from the world they once knew. Their story is a stark reminder that the true cost of North Korea's actions is measured not just in political or military terms, but in the currency of stolen lives and shattered families. The YS-11 hijacking was not just an attack on an airplane, it was an attack on the fundamental human right to freedom, and for 11 people and their families. The ordeal never truly ended. For decades, the story of the 11 unreturned abductees was one of silence and sorrow. They vanished behind the Iron Curtain of North Korea, their families in the South left with nothing but aging photographs and fading memories. The world moved on, but for these families, time was frozen on that dreadful day in 1969. The political stalemate between the 2 Koreas meant that any hope of a reunion seemed like a distant, impossible dream. The abductees were living ghosts, their existence acknowledged by the South but their fates unknown. They were trapped not only by a physical border, but by the immense political chasm that separated the 2 nations, a divide that seemed utterly insurmountable for ordinary people caught in its crossfire. Then, after more than 3 decades of agonizing separation, a small crack of light appeared in the darkness. As part of a carefully negotiated temporary thaw in inter-Korean relations, the two governments began organizing sporadic family reunion events. These meetings were rare, emotionally charged, and heavily controlled. They offered a brief, fleeting opportunity for a handful of families torn apart by the Korean War and subsequent conflicts to see each other for the first time in half a century. These were not permanent homecomings. They were brief, 3-day encounters, after which the northern participants were required to return. It was a bittersweet arrangement, a moment of joy wrapped in the certainty of another painful separation. In 2001, one of the YS-11 abductees was chosen to participate. Song Jeong-hwae, the young flight attendant who was just 24 at the time of the hijacking, was now a 56-year-old woman who had spent more of her life in North Korea than in her native South. She was granted permission to travel to the South to meet her mother, who was now in her 80s. The moment of their reunion was broadcast for the world to see, a raw and powerful display of emotion that transcended politics. The initial meeting was filled with a heart-wrenching confusion. Her elderly mother, her memory clouded by age and decades of grief, did not immediately recognize the middle-aged woman standing before her as her long-lost daughter. Mom, it's me, Jeong-hwae," the daughter repeated, her voice thick with emotion as she clasped her mother's hands. Suddenly, a flicker of recognition crossed the mother's face, and the dam of pent-up sorrow broke. The two women collapsed into each other's arms, their sobs telling a story of 32 years of stolen time. For 3 short days they tried to bridge the gap of a lifetime, sharing stories and tears. But the reunion was tragically temporary. Xiong had built a new life in the north. She was married and had children of her own there. Even if she had been given a choice, her family was now in North Korea. As the reunion ended, she had to say goodbye to her mother once more, returning to her life of captivity, a life she never chose. While the human tragedy of the separated families unfolded, North Korea was busy weaponizing the incident for its own gain. The regime's propaganda machine went into overdrive, crafting a seductive but entirely false narrative around the hijacker, Cho Chang-hui. They understood that their most potent weapon against the South was not necessarily military might, but psychological warfare. They aimed to exploit any existing discontent within South Korean society, targeting those who felt left behind by the country's rapid economic growth. The story they concocted was a powerful lure, a promise of a better life for those who dared to defy the Southern government and embrace the North. The core of this propaganda campaign was the claim that Cho had been showered with wealth and accolades. Leaflets and radio broadcasts aimed at the South depicted him as a national hero who had performed a courageous act of patriotism. They spread the rumor that he had received a staggering reward, a life-changing sum of money that would make him rich beyond his wildest dreams. This was a carefully constructed fantasy, designed to plant a seed in the minds of disillusioned South Koreans. The message was simple and powerful. The North rewards its heroes. It was a direct invitation, a cynical promise that fame and fortune awaited anyone who could deliver another plane and its passengers into their hands. This narrative was particularly potent because it piggybacked on the real anxieties of the time. The miracle on the Han River had created wealth, but it had also created inequality. For young men struggling to find work or living in poverty, the story of the hijacker turned millionaire was a tempting fantasy. It offered an escape route, a shortcut to a life of luxury and respect that seemed unattainable in the fiercely competitive South. The propaganda was not just broadcast, it was smuggled into the South on leaflets carried by balloons or in newspapers that found their way across the border, ensuring the message reached its intended audience. It was a poison arrow, aimed at the heart of South Korean society. The effectiveness of this campaign is hard to measure precisely, but its influence was undeniable. It created a dangerous mythos around the act of hijacking, transforming a violent crime into a supposed act of heroic defection. The North Korean government was not just celebrating the hijacking, it was actively soliciting more of them. They were laying a trap, baited with lies of wealth and glory. This insidious propaganda would have deadly consequences. It would directly inspire at least one other young man to follow in Cho's footsteps, leading him to believe that a similar act of aerial piracy would be his ticket to a better life. The stage was being set for another tragedy, fueled by the deceptive promises of the Pyongyang regime. The hijacking of the YS-11 was a brutal and humiliating lesson for South Korea. The incident exposed a catastrophic failure in national security, revealing just how vulnerable the country's civil aviation was to a single determined attacker. The public outcry was immense and the government was under intense pressure to ensure such a disaster could never happen again. The era of treating air travel like a casual bus ride was definitively over. In the immediate aftermath, the Korean Aviation Authority launched a complete and radical overhaul of its security procedures, fundamentally changing the experience of flying in the country forever. The open, trusting skies of the 1960s were to be replaced by a new reality of vigilance and fortification. The first and most visible change happened on the ground. Airport security, once a mere formality, was transformed into a rigorous, multi-layered process. Pre-boarding screenings became mandatory and strict. Authorities introduced new technologies, including metal detectors and scanners, to meticulously check both passengers and their luggage for any concealed weapons or prohibited items. The simple act of walking onto a plane was no longer simple. Every traveler became a potential threat that needed to be assessed, and every bag was a potential hiding place for a weapon. This new, stringent approach was designed to create a formidable barrier, to stop a would-be hijacker long before they could even step foot on an aircraft. The security enhancements were not limited to the airport terminal, they extended into the very design of the aircraft cabin. Recognizing that the unlocked cockpit door was the critical point of failure in the YS-11 incident, a new mandate was issued. All commercial airliners were to be retrofitted with armored, bulletproof cockpit doors. These reinforced barriers were designed to be impenetrable from the passenger cabin, creating a secure sanctuary for the pilots. The door, once a symbol of openness, was now a hardened shield, ensuring that no matter what chaos erupted among the passengers, control of the aircraft would remain firmly in the hands of the flight crew. This physical separation was a clear admission that the trust between crew and passengers had been irrevocably broken. Perhaps the most significant and dramatic new measure was the introduction of armed sky marshals. The government decided that passive security measures were not enough. They needed an active in-flight deterrent. From that point forward, it became mandatory for an armed security officer to be present on every single domestic and international flight. These plainclothes officers, blending in with the other passengers, were highly trained agents tasked with one single critical mission: to protect the aircraft from any hijacking attempt and to use lethal force if necessary. South Korea was taking no more chances. The skies were now patrolled from within, a clear message to any potential hijacker that their next attempt would be met with armed resistance. The aftermath of the YS-11 hijacking forced South Korea into a new reality. The nation's sense of security had been profoundly shaken, and the government responded with a series of sweeping changes designed to fortify its defenses against aerial terrorism. The lax, almost casual atmosphere that once characterized air travel was gone forever, replaced by a rigid and visible system of control. The goal was to make hijacking not just difficult, but impossible. The new protocols were intended to be a powerful statement, a declaration that the skies over South Korea were now a hardened target. The nation was determined to learn from its painful lesson and ensure that no other flight would suffer the same fate. These new security measures created a powerful illusion of control. The presence of metal detectors at airport gates, the thorough searching of luggage, and the mandatory armored cockpit doors all contributed to a renewed sense of safety among the traveling public. The most significant addition, the armed sky marshal on every flight, was the ultimate guarantee. This officer was a hidden guardian, a silent protector blending in with the passengers, ready to neutralize any threat at a moment's notice. The combination of these measures, technological, structural, and human, was believed to have sealed every possible vulnerability. The system seemed foolproof, a perfect defense against the kind of attack that had brought the YS-11 down. For a little over a year, this new system held. Flights continued their daily routines, crisscrossing the country under the watchful eye of the enhanced security apparatus. Passengers grew accustomed to the new procedures, accepting them as a necessary inconvenience for the sake of safety. The trauma of the 1969 hijacking began to fade into a cautionary tale, a story from a bygone era of vulnerability. It seemed that the government's decisive actions had worked. The threat had been identified, the weaknesses addressed, and the problem solved. A new, secure chapter in Korean aviation history had begun, or so it appeared. The nation let out a collective sigh of relief, believing the danger had passed. However, this newfound sense of security was a fragile veneer. While the authorities had prepared for a repeat of the last attack, they failed to anticipate a new kind of threat, one that was more desperate, more violent, and more cunning. The very defenses they had erected would soon be put to the ultimate test by a young man who had spent the past year studying them, not to be deterred, but to find a way to overcome them. He understood the new rules of the game, and had devised a plan to break them all. The security overhaul had created a challenge, and he was ready to meet it with devastating force. A new threat was brewing, ready to exploit the one vulnerability no system can ever fully eliminate: human ingenuity in the service of destruction. January 23, 1971. It was a cold winter day, just over 13 months after the YS-11 incident. At the airport in Sokcho, another coastal city not far from Gangneung, passengers were boarding a Korean Airlines domestic flight bound for Seoul. This time the aircraft was a Dutch-made Fokker F27 Friendship, a reliable turboprop with a capacity for about 60 passengers. The scene was one of familiar routine. Travelers hurried through the terminal, their breath fogging in the chilly air. They were a cross-section of society business people heading to the capital, families on visits, young and old, each with their own story and destination in mind. The flight was short, a quick hop over the mountains, expected to last less than an hour. Among the passengers queuing to board was a young man. He was unremarkable in his appearance, just another face in the crowd. However, he was carrying something that set him apart: a small, ordinary-looking box. In the new security environment, luggage was checked more carefully, but his package seemed innocuous, perhaps containing gifts or food. No one gave it a second glance. Yet inside this simple box lay the instruments of chaos, the key to his dark plan. Its contents would soon transform the mundane flight into a terrifying ordeal, proving that even the most stringent security measures could be bypassed by a determined and clever adversary. The unseen danger had already slipped past the first line of defense. As the passengers settled into their seats, the cabin buzzed with the quiet chatter of anticipation. People stowed their carry-on bags, fastened their seatbelts, and perhaps exchanged a few words with their neighbors. The flight attendant moved through the aisle, ensuring everyone was ready for departure, her presence a comforting sign of order and safety. The armed security officer was also on board, a silent and vigilant presence, his eyes scanning the cabin for any sign of trouble. The passengers, unaware of his true role, would have seen him as just another traveler. Everything seemed to be in order, a perfectly normal start to a perfectly normal flight. In the cockpit, the captain and co-pilot went through their pre-flight checklist, their movements practiced and precise. They received clearance from the control tower, and the Fokker F27 began its taxi down the runway. With a powerful roar from its twin engines, the plane accelerated, lifted off the ground, and climbed steadily into the sky. Below them, the coastal city of Sokcho shrank into the distance. The plane rose through the clouds, reaching its cruising altitude. For a few precious minutes, there was peace. The passengers relaxed, lulled by the drone of the engines, each lost in their own thoughts, completely oblivious to the fact that they were flying towards a nightmare. The crew entrusted with the safety of this flight was a small, dedicated team of 4. In the cockpit sat the captain, Lee Kang-hun, and his co-pilot, Jang Myong-se. Captain Lee was an experienced aviator, calm and professional. His co-pilot, Jang, was a man in his 40s with a unique background. He was a retired military pilot, highly skilled in the art of flying fighter jets, but he was still considered a trainee in the world of commercial aviation. The transition from nimble military aircraft to larger passenger planes required a different set of skills and, honestly, a period of adjustment. He had been training for a full year, but was still learning the ropes under the captain's watchful eye. Despite his trainee status, the co-pilot was eager and competent. Before the flight, Captain Lee had shared some encouraging news with him. He told Jang that he believed he was finally ready to handle one of the most critical phases of flight: the landing. The captain planned to let him take the controls for the approach into Seoul's Gimpo Airport. This was a significant vote of confidence, a rite of passage for any new commercial pilot. The co-pilot was thrilled by the news, his spirits lifted by the captain's trust in his abilities. He looked forward to the end of the flight with a mix of excitement and professional focus, eager to prove himself worthy of the captain's faith. In the passenger cabin, 2 other crew members were responsible for the well-being of the passengers. The flight attendant, Choi Seokja, was tasked with ensuring comfort and order, her warm demeanor helping to create a relaxed atmosphere. The 4th member of the crew was the security officer, Choi Cheon-il. He was the product of the new security era, an armed agent whose sole purpose was to prevent a hijacking. He remained on high alert throughout the flight, his training compelling him to constantly observe the passengers, looking for any unusual behavior or sign of a threat. He and the flight attendant were the first line of defense in the cabin, the guardians of the armored cockpit door. These four individuals, the veteran captain, the eager co-pilot, the caring flight attendant, and the vigilant security officer, formed the team that stood between the passengers and any potential danger. They were professionals, each with a specific role to play in the safe operation of the flight. They had no reason to believe this trip would be any different from the countless others they had completed. They were prepared for routine operations and trained for emergencies, but they could not have imagined the ferocity of the attack they were about to face. Their courage, skill, and resilience would soon be tested in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Once the plane reached a stable cruising altitude, the crew settled into their flight routines. The co-pilot engaged the autopilot, allowing the aircraft to fly its pre-planned course towards Seoul. The security officer, Choi Cheon-il, made sure the armored cockpit door was securely locked, creating the physical barrier that was now standard procedure. He then began a slow patrol down the aisle, his presence a quiet reassurance, his eyes methodically scanning the rows of passengers. Everything appeared calm. The passengers were reading, chatting, or gazing out the windows at the sea of clouds below. The atmosphere was one of peaceful transit, a bubble of normalcy suspended miles above the earth. It was at this moment that the young man with the box decided to act. He stood up from his seat, retrieved his package from the overhead compartment, and opened it. Inside, for anyone who might have glanced over, were what looked like ordinary tin cans, perhaps containing food or drinks. It was a clever disguise designed to appear non-threatening. With the security officer positioned in the middle of the aisle, his back turned towards the front of the plane, the young man saw his opportunity. He moved with a chilling purposefulness, walking directly to the front of the cabin, towards the one thing that stood between him and his goal, the armored cockpit door. The passengers seated in the front rows watched in confusion as he took one of the cans and affixed it to the handle of the cockpit door. It was a strange and unsettling action, but before they could fully process what was happening, the situation escalated dramatically. The young man produced a lighter and ignited a fuse protruding from the can. In that instant, the truth became horrifyingly clear. The can was not for food, it was a homemade bomb. He was not just a strange passenger, he was a hijacker, and he was about to blow the cockpit door open. Panic began to ripple through the front of the cabin as the small fuse burned, sparking its way towards detonation. Before the passengers could even scream or alert the security officer, the hijacker unleashed the second part of his assault. He pulled another can from his box. This one was different. It did not have a long fuse but was designed like a military-style hand grenade. He pulled the pin and without hesitation hurled it down the aisle towards the security officer. The officer, hearing the commotion, turned just in time to see the deadly projectile arcing through the air towards him. He instinctively shouted a warning to the passengers. "Bomb! Bomb! Get your heads down!" A final act of duty before the explosion would engulf him. The hijacker's gambit was in motion, a violent two-pronged attack designed to simultaneously breach the cockpit and eliminate the plane's only armed defender. The security officer, Choi Cheon-il, had only a split second to react. His training kicked in, but time was his enemy. As he yelled his warning to the passengers, he reflexively reached for the pistol holstered at his side. But before his fingers could even grasp the handle, the grenade exploded in the narrow aisle directly in front of him. The blast was a concussive force of shrapnel and noise, tearing through the cabin with brutal efficiency. The officer was thrown violently backward, the impact slamming his head against the cabin wall and rendering him unconscious instantly. His body slumped to the floor and his firearm, dislodged by the force of the explosion, flew from its holster and skittered away, lost somewhere among the seats and panicked passengers. In the cockpit, Captain Lee and co-pilot Jang felt the explosion as a violent jolt that shuddered through the entire airframe. They heard the muffled but distinct sound of the blast from the passenger cabin, a sound no pilot ever wants to hear. Instinctively, the co-pilot, Jang, grabbed the control yoke, his military training taking over as he fought to keep the aircraft stable against the sudden, unexplained turbulence. The captain turned in his seat, his eyes wide with alarm, trying to peer back through the small window in the armored door to understand the source of the chaos. It was a natural human reaction, a desperate need to see what was happening on the other side of the wall that separated them from their passengers. That reflexive turn, however, placed him directly in the path of the second explosion. At that very moment, the bomb the hijacker had attached to the cockpit door detonated. The armored door held, but the force of the blast sent a shower of metal fragments and shrapnel ripping through the cockpit. One of these deadly projectiles struck Captain Lee with pinpoint accuracy, hitting him just above his eye. The pain was immediate and blinding, a searing agony that ripped a cry from his lips. He slumped forward in his seat, clutching his face, his vision instantly compromised. In the span of a few seconds, the flight crew's command center had been breached, the captain was severely wounded, and the plane's only armed guard was neutralized. The passenger cabin was plunged into a state of absolute terror and pandemonium. The twin explosions had created a scene from a nightmare. The force of the Isle bomb had ripped a gaping hole in the side of the plane's fuselage, causing a sudden and violent depressurization. The air rushed out with a deafening roar, and a swirling vortex of wind and debris filled the cabin. Loose items were sucked towards the hole as the plane's internal pressure equalized with the thin, cold air outside. Passengers screamed in terror, clinging to their armrests, their worlds turned upside down by the sudden, catastrophic violence that had erupted in their midst, miles above the safety of the ground. The hole in the fuselage was a critical wound. The sudden depressurization and structural damage caused the Fokker F27 to lose aerodynamic stability. The aircraft, mortally wounded, immediately began to lurch and plummet towards the ground. It entered a steep, uncontrolled dive, hurtling towards the jagged mountain peaks of the Korean peninsula below. The passengers were thrown against their seatbelts, their screams lost in the roar of the wind whipping through the cabin. For those terrifying moments, it seemed certain that the plane would crash, a final, fiery end to the hijacking before it had even truly begun. The aircraft was no longer flying, it was falling out of the sky. In the cockpit, co-pilot Jang Myung-se wrestled with the controls with every ounce of his strength. He was fighting against the violent forces tearing at the plane, his knuckles white as he gripped the yoke. Beside him, Captain Lee was groaning in pain, his face covered in blood from his severe head wound, but his mind was still on his duty. "The throttle!" he managed to gasp out, urging his co-pilot to give the engines more power. Jang responded, pushing the throttle levers forward. The plane's twin turboprop engines roared to life, screaming in protest as they fought against the dive, their power the only thing that could arrest the terrifying descent. It was a desperate battle against gravity and time. The mountaintops grew larger in the cockpit window, rushing up to meet them with terrifying speed. The co-pilot pulled back on the control column with all his might, trying to lift the plane's nose out of its death dive. For a moment, it seemed hopeless. Then, at an impossibly low altitude, just as the rocky peaks seemed close enough to touch, the aircraft began to respond. The nose, slowly, agonizingly, began to lift. With a final Herculean effort, Jang pulled the plane out of the dive, skimming just over the mountaintops. The Fokker F27 was flying again, albeit badly damaged and barely under control. Having narrowly averted disaster, the co-pilot managed to bring the aircraft to a semblance of level flight. The immediate crisis of the crash was over, but their ordeal was far from finished. The captain, still bleeding and in immense pain, turned to his co-pilot with a weak, trembling voice. "What happened? What was that explosion?" he asked, his mind struggling to process the chaos. Jang, his own heart pounding with adrenaline, could only shake his head. "I have no idea," he replied, glancing back and noticing for the first time the ragged hole in the cabin wall, and the unconscious forms of passengers who had fainted from the sudden pressure change. They had saved the plane, but they were flying blind into an even greater danger. While the pilots fought for control of their crippled aircraft, the hijacker, Kim Sang-tae, emerged from the chaos he had created. He had weathered the explosions by hiding behind a row of seats and now stood up, a figure of menace amidst the terrified and injured passengers. He was holding another of his homemade bombs, brandishing it as a symbol of his authority. He wasted no time. He pushed through the shattered remains of the cockpit door and entered the pilot's sanctuary, bringing the terror directly to the flight deck. He thrust the bomb into the faces of the wounded captain and the exhausted co-pilot, his eyes wild and determined. "The plane is under my control," he announced, his voice cutting through the lingering ringing in their ears. "Head to the ocean, now!" His demand was precise. Their original flight path was an inland route from Sokcho to Seoul. The hijacker wanted them to divert east, out over the Sea of Japan. This was a calculated move. Flying north along the coast was the easiest and most direct way to cross into North Korean airspace, avoiding the most heavily defended sections of the inland DMZ. It was the exact same route that the successful 1969 hijacking of the YS-11 had taken. Kim Sang-tae was following a proven playbook, intending to replicate that earlier success. The hijacker reiterated his threat, his voice laced with a dangerous edge. "Follow my orders and no one will die," he promised, the bomb in his hand a stark contradiction to his words. The co-pilot, Yang, now had to shift from being a pilot saving a plane to a negotiator saving lives. The captain was too badly injured to take command. Jang looked at the nervous hijacker and tried to buy time. "All right, we'll do as you say," he said, trying to keep his voice calm and steady. "But I need to check the cabin first. The explosion blew a hole in the plane, the pressure is gone. We can't fly properly unless we deal with it." This attempt at reasoning was met with immediate aggression. The hijacker, Kim, was not interested in delays or technical problems. He pulled a knife from his jacket, its blade glinting in the cockpit light, and pressed it against the co-pilot's throat. "Follow my orders," he snarled, his patience clearly gone. "Head to the ocean now." Any pretense of negotiation was over. The hijacker was on edge, his actions growing more erratic and violent. It was clear that any further argument or resistance would have deadly consequences. The co-pilot was now trapped between a man with a bomb and a knife, and the responsibility for everyone on board. Seeing the knife at his co-pilot's throat, the gravely injured Captain Lee knew he had to intervene. The hijacker was on the verge of snapping, and a dead co-pilot would mean certain doom for everyone. Despite his pain, the captain spoke with a voice of forced calm. "All right, no need for violence. We will cooperate with you," he said, trying to de-escalate the terrifying situation. "I will turn the plane toward the ocean. Let my co-pilot go check the hole in the cabin. Please, we have to fix the pressure problem first. Trust me, we will go wherever you want. We will fully cooperate." His plea was a desperate gamble to regain a sliver of control over their fate. To their immense relief, the captain's words seemed to have an effect. The hijacker, Kim, appeared to calm down slightly. Perhaps the captain's assurance of full cooperation lowered his guard, or perhaps he understood on some level that a functioning plane was necessary for his plan to succeed. He slowly lowered the knife from the co-pilot's throat and gave a curt nod, allowing Jang to leave the cockpit and attend to the damage in the cabin. It was a small victory, a brief reprieve that the co-pilot knew he had to use wisely. He immediately got up and went back into the passenger cabin to confront the chaos firsthand. The scene that greeted him was one of devastation. Passengers were injured, bleeding, and in a state of shock. The wind howled through the gash in the fuselage. Jang knew he had to do something to cover the hole, not just for the pressure but to restore some sense of order and hope among the terrified passengers. He began stuffing bags and seat cushions into the opening, a makeshift and flimsy barrier against the elements. He called out to the flight attendant, Choi Seokja, asking her to bring the cargo net that was used to secure luggage. Together, they stretched the net over the pile of bags and tied it as tightly as they could to the surrounding seats, creating a crude but essential patch. While working, the co-pilot's eyes scanned the cabin, taking stock of the human cost. He saw the unconscious form of the security officer, Choi Cheon-il, slumped in a seat where he had been moved. Jang noticed the officer's empty holster and realized the gun was missing. He whispered urgently to the flight attendant, "The security officer's gun is gone. If you find it, hide it. Don't let the hijacker get it." He also instructed her to get the first aid kit and tend to the injured as best she could. Even as he tried to fix the plane, he was trying to manage the crisis, deputizing the flight attendant and looking for any advantage, however small, in the desperate fight for their lives. As the flight attendant administered first aid and the co-pilot returned to the flight deck, the tense standoff in the air, continued. The plane was now flying east, out over the ocean, following the hijacker's command. With the immediate crisis of the depressurization somewhat managed, the wounded captain tried to engage the hijacker, Kim Sang-tae, in conversation. He wanted to understand the man's motives, maybe even find a way to reason with him. "Why?" the captain asked, his voice weak. "Why do you want to go to North Korea? What is there for you?" He was probing for a weakness, a human connection that might, just maybe, defuse the bomb Kim held in his hand. The hijacker responded not with anger but with a strange, almost defensive pride. "Why are you so afraid of North Korea?" he retorted. "You act like we are flying to our doom." There are people living there, living well. My brother is there. He is an officer and he lives a life of luxury. The captain pressed him. So you are doing all of this just to see your brother? In response, Kim pulled a worn, folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was a newspaper clipping, a piece of North Korean propaganda that had been smuggled south. It was an article about the 1969 YS-11 hijacking, celebrating the hijacker Cho Seung-hee as a hero. The headline on the propaganda piece was a direct invitation. The heroic defector Cho Seung-hee invites you to come to the north. This clipping was Kim's inspiration, his treasure map to a better life. He had swallowed the North Korean propaganda whole. He believed the stories that the first hijacker had been given a reward of $2 million and was living as a celebrated hero of the regime. He saw hijacking not as a crime, but as a path to glory, wealth, and most importantly, a reunion with the brother he believed was thriving in the supposed workers' paradise. His desperation had made him a perfect target for the North's psychological warfare. The hijacker's full story began to emerge. Kim Sang-tae was a 22-year-old man who felt like a failure in the competitive society of South Korea. He was impoverished and struggled to find steady work, feeling left behind by his country's economic miracle. His older brother, a soldier captured during the Korean War, had been taken to the north decades ago. Kim clung to the belief, likely fueled by propaganda, that his brother had not only survived but had become a high-ranking officer. The story of the first hijacker provided him with what he saw as a golden opportunity, a way to escape his poverty, become a hero, and reunite with his family, all in one audacious act. For over a year he had meticulously planned his attack, learning to make bombs and studying the new airport security, driven by a dangerous cocktail of hope and despair. The hijacker Kim remained hyper-vigilant, his eyes darting between the pilots in the cockpit and the passengers in the cabin. His gaze fell upon the security officer, who was beginning to stir, slowly regaining consciousness in his seat at the rear of the plane. Kim recognized this as a potential threat. Even though the officer was injured and unarmed, he could rally the passengers or attempt to overpower him. To eliminate this risk permanently, the hijacker acted quickly. He grabbed a coil of rope from his bag, threw it to two male passengers sitting nearby, and ordered them to tie the security officer up, reinforcing his command by brandishing his knife and the bomb. The passengers, terrified and caught in an impossible position, had no choice but to obey. Under the hijacker's menacing watch, they tightly bound the semi-conscious security officer to his seat. Kim stood over them, ensuring the knots were secure, effectively neutralizing the last symbol of official authority on the plane. He had noticed that the officer's gun was missing, but it didn't seem to worry him excessively. His confidence rested in the explosive device he held in his hand. He believed he held the ultimate trump card. If anyone, be it a passenger or a hidden sky marshal he didn't know about, tried to shoot him, he would simply pull the pin. He repeated this threat multiple times, making sure everyone understood the stakes. "I came here ready to die," he shouted, his voice echoing through the tense cabin. "So I have no problem taking all of you to hell with me. Don't try anything stupid." This declaration was meant to quell any thoughts of resistance. He was establishing a grim form of mutually assured destruction. His own life meant nothing to him, which made him an incredibly dangerous adversary. He had made it clear that any attempt to be a hero would result in the deaths of everyone on board, transforming the passengers from potential allies of the crew into fellow hostages, paralyzed by fear. While the hijacker was distracted with securing the officer, the co-pilot, Jong, saw a fleeting opportunity for deception. He quietly reached down and broke the glass cover of the plane's fuel gauge, a small act of sabotage that he hoped he could use to his advantage. He leaned over to the wounded captain and whispered his desperate plan. "Let's try to trick him," he murmured. "Let's convince him we're almost out of fuel and have to land, that we've already reached North Korea." The captain, despite his agony, understood the gambit and agreed. It was a long shot, a bluff that would depend entirely on their ability to sell a convincing performance to their volatile captor. With their desperate plan whispered between them, the wounded captain and the determined co-pilot began their performance. The captain, summoning a strength he did not know he possessed, reached for the cabin microphone. His voice, though weak and strained from his injury, filled the aircraft, carrying a message of feigned surrender. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain," he announced, his words carefully chosen to be heard by both the passengers and, more importantly, the hijacker. "Our plane has been forced to head to North Korea, and we will be entering its airspace shortly. For your own safety upon arrival, please destroy any personal identification you may have. This announcement was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation, designed to make the hijacker believe his goal was within reach. This instruction served a dual purpose, a testament to the captain's quick thinking even in agony. Firstly, it was the cornerstone of the bluff. By announcing their imminent arrival in North Korea, he was setting the stage for their fake landing. He was selling the lie to the hijacker, making him believe they were much further north than they actually were. Secondly, the advice was genuinely sound. Should their ruse fail and they were indeed forced to land in the north, destroying identification cards would make it harder for North Korean authorities to identify passengers. The passengers, hearing the captain's voice, began to react. There was a rustle of movement throughout the cabin as people began pulling out their wallets and papers. They tore up their national ID cards, driver's licenses, and business cards, the small pieces of paper fluttering to the floor like tragic confetti. This collective act of destruction added a powerful layer of authenticity to the captain's gambit. While the passengers were occupied, the co-pilot played his part. He subtly pressed a series of buttons on the control panel, deliberately triggering a cacophony of alarms and warning lights. The cockpit was suddenly filled with blaring sounds and flashing indicators, creating a sense of critical system failure. The hijacker, Kim, immediately whipped his head around, his eyes wide with alarm. "What is that noise?" he demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion and anxiety. The trap was now set. The stage was dressed, the actors were in place, and the final, most dangerous act of their performance was about to begin. The co-pilot, Yang, looked at the hijacker with a feigned expression of panic, pointing a trembling finger towards the instrument panel he had sabotaged. "The fuel is running low!" he exclaimed, his voice laced with urgency. "Look at the gauge! It's dropping fast!" The hijacker glanced at the broken gauge, which now showed the fuel needle hovering near empty. The captain then delivered the next line of their script with perfect timing. He turned to his co-pilot and said with an air of weary resignation, "There's no other choice. Begin the landing procedure. We have to put her down now." They were trying to create an emergency within an emergency, forcing the hijacker's hand and making him believe that landing immediately was the only option for survival. The hijacker, however, was not a complete fool. His year of planning had given him some sense of timing and distance. "Do you think I'm stupid?" he snarled, suspicion flashing in his eyes. "There's no way we've reached North Korea this quickly." He was right. They were still flying over the water, but they were approaching the South Korean coastline again, far south of the DMZ. The co-pilot had to sell the lie with conviction. He gestured frantically at the coastline coming into view. "The explosion damaged the fuel lines. We crossed the border a while ago while you were dealing with the passengers. That's a North Korean airfield down there. We have to land, or we will all crash into the sea." The combination of the blaring alarms, the low fuel gauge, the captain's authority, and the approaching runway seemed to overwhelm the hijacker's skepticism. His desire to succeed and the fear of a crash clouded his judgment. He reluctantly gave his consent, allowing the co-pilot to begin the approach. Jang took manual control of the aircraft, his hands steady despite the immense pressure. He skillfully guided the damaged Fokker F27 towards the coastline, aiming for a military airstrip he recognized near the city of Goseong. This was a South Korean military base, but from the air, one airstrip looks much like another. The hijacker, unfamiliar with the geography, had no way of knowing he was being tricked. As the plane descended, the co-pilot's heart pounded in his chest. This was the landing he had been promised by the captain at the start of the day, but not under circumstances he could have ever imagined. He had to perform the most difficult landing of his life in a damaged aircraft, with a wounded captain beside him, and a homicidal maniac with a bomb standing over his shoulder. The wheels touched down on the runway with a screech of tires, the plane bouncing but holding steady. He had done it. They were on the ground, but they were on South Korean soil, and the hijacker still believed he was in the north. The most dangerous part of their ordeal had just begun. As the Fokker F27 slowed on the runway, the hijacker, Kim Sang-tae, peered out the cockpit window, expecting to see North Korean soldiers and a welcoming committee for his heroic arrival. Instead, he saw nothing but an empty airstrip. There were no people, no vehicles, no signs of life. A cold dread began to creep into his mind as the seconds ticked by. "Where is everyone?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and dawning rage. "Why is no one here to meet us?" The perfect landing had now given way to a terrifyingly awkward silence. and the crew's carefully constructed illusion was beginning to crumble under the weight of reality. The captain, thinking fast, tried to salvage the situation with another lie. "This is a military airfield," he said, his voice calm. "They are probably being cautious. We have to taxi closer to the terminal building. They will be there." He hoped to buy a few more precious minutes to get the plane closer to any soldiers or security forces that might be stationed at the base. The co-pilot, following the captain's lead, began to slowly taxi the aircraft down the long runway, moving away from the isolated stretch where they had landed, and towards the main buildings of the airbase. Every foot they traveled was a gamble, stretching the hijacker's patience to its breaking point. Meanwhile, the authorities on the ground were in a state of high alert. They had tracked the hijacked plane's distress signal and its erratic flight path. The unexpected landing at a South Korean military base had confirmed their hopes that the crew was attempting to resist. Soldiers and police immediately surrounded the airfield, taking up positions but keeping their distance. They knew the hijacker was armed with explosives, and that any sudden move could provoke him into detonating them, killing everyone on board. They were in a standoff, watching the slow-moving plane, waiting for a signal, for any opportunity to intervene without causing a catastrophe. Inside the cockpit, the hijacker's suspicion finally boiled over into certainty. As they taxied closer to the base buildings, he likely saw a sign or a symbol that was unmistakably South Korean. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had been tricked. He was not a hero in North Korea. He was a trapped criminal in the country he had tried to escape, his face contorted in a mask of pure fury. "You lied to me!" he screamed, his voice cracking with betrayal and rage. He raised the bomb high, his thumb on the pin. "Turn this plane around, take off now or we all die right here." The ruse was over. The plane was stopped, surrounded, and a violent conclusion seemed inevitable. With the hijacker's rage at its peak, and his finger on the trigger of his bomb, the situation in the cockpit reached its terrifying climax. He was screaming, demanding they take off immediately and fly to the north. But the co-pilot, Yang, knew taking off was impossible. The plane was damaged, low on fuel, and now surrounded by the military. There was no escape. He tried to reason with the hysterical hijacker, but words were useless. The hijacker, his dreams of glory shattered, was now a cornered animal ready to lash out with deadly force. He was ready to fulfill his promise to take everyone to hell with him. The time for tricks and deception was over. As the hijacker's threats reached a fever pitch, a sudden movement caught his eye. A passenger, a man who had been sitting quietly until this moment, suddenly lunged forward from his seat, attempting to tackle the hijacker and disarm him. It was an act of incredible bravery, a desperate attempt to end the standoff. But the hijacker was ready. He shoved the passenger back violently. At the same time, the bound security officer, having managed to free one of his hands, was trying to lunge forward as well. The cabin descended into a frantic, chaotic struggle. The hijacker, enraged and panicked by the assault, made a fatal decision. He pulled the pin on his final bomb. In that split second, as the hijacker prepared to release the grenade that would obliterate the plane, co-pilot Jang Myung-se acted. He did not run. He did not hide. He saw the activated bomb in the hijacker's hand and knew what he had to do. With a cry, he threw himself out of his pilot's seat and lunged at the hijacker. He did not try to disarm him or wrestle the bomb away. Instead, he grabbed the hijacker in a bear hug, pressing the man's body, and the bomb clutched in his hand, against his own. He used his body as a shield, a living barrier to absorb the force of the blast and protect the others in the cockpit and the passengers just beyond the shattered door. The bomb detonated. The explosion was contained, muffled by the co-pilot's selfless act. The hijacker, Kim Sang-tae, was killed instantly. Co-pilot Jang Myung-se, the man who had landed the plane and fought for every life on board, was mortally wounded. He had made the ultimate sacrifice, trading his life for the lives of his captain, his crew, and his passengers. In the aftermath of the blast, with the primary threat eliminated, South Korean commandos stormed the plane, securing the cabin and evacuating the terrified, weeping passengers to safety. The ordeal of the Fokker F27 was finally over, brought to an end not by a trick or a negotiation, but by an extraordinary act of heroism and sacrifice. The smoking, damaged fuselage of the Fokker F27, resting on that South Korean military runway, stood as a stark monument to a day of terror and extraordinary courage. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of activity as authorities secured the aircraft and tended to the wounded and traumatized survivors. The passengers, who had boarded a routine flight only hours earlier, stumbled out into the daylight. their faces etched with the horror they had witnessed. They were the lucky ones, survivors of a violent hijacking that could have ended in a catastrophic crash or a life of captivity. Their survival was a direct result of the bravery and quick thinking of a crew that refused to surrender to fear, even in the face of death itself. The story immediately became a national epic of heroism against all odds. The cost of this survival, however, was tragically high. Co-pilot Jang Myong-se, the retired military pilot who had been so thrilled at the prospect of landing his first commercial flight, succumbed to his injuries. He was posthumously hailed as a national hero, his selfless act of shielding the blast with his own body celebrated as the ultimate sacrifice. Captain Lee Kang-hun, despite being grievously wounded in the initial explosion, survived, his leadership and calm deception having been instrumental in creating the opportunity for escape. The passengers and other crew members would carry the psychological scars of their ordeal for the rest of their lives, the memory of the explosions and the constant threat of death, a permanent part of their personal histories. The nation mourned the loss of a hero while celebrating the resilience of the survivors who had stared into the abyss and returned. In the wake of the incident, the South Korean government showered accolades upon the crew. They were decorated for their bravery. Their story held up as an example of patriotism and courage in the face of communist aggression. The narrative was one of triumph, a victory for the South in the ongoing psychological war with the North. The successful thwarting of the hijacking was a powerful counterpoint to the humiliating loss of the YS-11 just a year prior. It demonstrated that the new security measures, while not foolproof, had provided a framework within which determined individuals could fight back. The story of the Fokker F27 was not just about survival. It was about defiance, a refusal to be pawns in North Korea's cruel games. Yet beneath the public celebration of heroism lies a more complex legacy. The incident served as a chilling reminder of the lengths to which a desperate individual, fueled by state propaganda, would go. It proved that even the most robust physical security, armored doors and armed guards, could be overcome by sufficient violence and a willingness to die. The true defense in the end had been human courage, a variable that can never be guaranteed. The scars left by this hijacking were not just on the bodies of the wounded or the minds of the survivors, they were etched into the nation's psyche, a permanent reminder of the fragility of peace and the ever-present threat from just across the border, a threat that could manifest itself not as an invading army but as a single man with a bomb in a box. While the story of the Fokker F-27 concluded with a dramatic and heroic finale on South Korean soil, the tragedy of the YS-11 continued its silent, agonizing course. The fates of the two flights offer a stark contrast, one ending in a celebrated, albeit costly victory, the other dissolving into a lingering, unresolved sorrow. For the families of the 11 individuals who were never returned from the 1969 hijacking, there was no closure, no final confrontation, only an endless wait. Their loved ones remained prisoners in the North, their lives stolen and repurposed by a hostile regime. This ongoing captivity stands as a powerful testament to the deepest and most enduring wound of the Korean conflict, the division of families. The pain of these families is a quiet but constant echo of the hijackings North Korea wants the world to forget. The brief, tearful reunion between flight attendant Seong Jong-hwae and her elderly mother in 2001 was a rare glimmer of light in a decades-long story of darkness. Yet, even this moment was bittersweet, a temporary reprieve that only highlighted the cruelty of their permanent separation. For every family that is granted this fleeting contact, tens of thousands more remain completely cut off, with no knowledge of whether their relatives in the North are alive or dead. These separated families are the living casualties of the Korean War and the Cold War that followed, their personal tragedies often overshadowed by the larger geopolitical narrative of missiles and nuclear threats. Their suffering is a profound human-scale indictment of the political stalemate that has gripped the peninsula for over 70 years. The issue of these abductees and separated families remains a major point of contention in inter-Korean relations to this day. South Korean governments, regardless of their political leaning, have consistently raised the issue with the North, demanding the return of their citizens and more frequent and larger-scale family reunions. However, these human rights concerns are often used by Pyongyang as a bargaining chip, a tool to be leveraged for economic aid or political concessions. The lives of these individuals are treated as commodities on a negotiating table, their freedom subject to the whims of a regime that sees human beings as instruments of state policy. The pain of the families is thus compounded by the frustrating reality that their loved ones are pawns in a cynical political game. The legacy of these hijackings, therefore, is not just about aviation security or tales of heroism, it is fundamentally about this deep, unseen wound of separation. The stories of the unreturned passengers and crew of the YS-11 are a microcosm of a national trauma affecting millions. They represent the fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters who were swallowed by the North, leaving behind a void that can never be filled. As the generation that directly remembers the division ages and passes away, the urgency of resolving these cases grows. Forgetting these hijackings means forgetting the people they affected, and for a nation built on the ideal of a shared bloodline, forgetting family is the most painful loss of all. The two hijackings, occurring just over a year apart, serve as a perfect case study in the propaganda war that has defined the Korean conflict. North Korea's handling of the YS-11 incident was a masterclass in turning a criminal act into a political victory. By fabricating the story of the pilot's defection and broadcasting the myth of the heroic, wealthy hijacker, Pyongyang weaponized the event. They sought to project an image of a prosperous and desirable nation that people would risk their lives to join, while simultaneously attempting to incite social unrest and copycat attacks in the South. This strategy reveals a deep understanding of psychological warfare, where perception can be more powerful than reality. The goal was not just to acquire a plane and skilled personnel, but to score a major victory in the battle for hearts and minds. The tragic story of Kim Sang-tae, the hijacker of the Fokker F27, demonstrates the chilling effectiveness of this propaganda. He was not a hardened state agent, but a desperate young man who had been seduced by a lie. He was a victim of the North's information war, just as much as he was a perpetrator of a violent crime. His actions were driven by a belief in the fantasy that Pyongyang had so carefully constructed, a fantasy of reunion, wealth, and heroism. This shows that the casualties of propaganda are not just figurative. They can be very real. Kim's death, and the terror he inflicted, were the direct result of a cynical state-sponsored campaign of disinformation designed to exploit the vulnerable. South Korea, in turn, used the outcome of the second hijacking for its own propaganda purposes. The story of co-pilot Jong's sacrifice and the crew's successful defiance was framed as a moral and patriotic triumph over the evil and deception of the North. It was a story of good versus evil, courage versus cowardice, and sacrifice versus selfishness. This narrative served to bolster national morale, reinforce the legitimacy of the Southern government, and demonize the Northern regime. The starkly different outcomes of the two events allowed the South to craft a powerful message. While the North uses lies to lure and destroy, the South is defended by heroes willing to lay down their lives for their fellow citizens. The conflict was thus played out not only in the sky but also in the headlines and history books. Ultimately, these events highlight the tragic reality that in the great geopolitical game between the two Koreas, ordinary people are often the pawns. The passengers on both flights, the crew members, the hijackers themselves, and their families were all caught in a struggle far larger than their own lives. Their fates were dictated by the political ambitions and ideological battles of their respective states. The hijackings were not merely crimes, they were moves on a grand chessboard, with human lives as the price of each maneuver. This cold, calculated approach to human life is perhaps the most damning legacy of the conflict, a reminder that behind the political posturing and military standoffs, there are countless individual tragedies that are all too easily forgotten. The era of the 1960s and 70s was a turbulent time for global aviation, often called the golden age of hijacking. The Korean incidents, however, were unique, deeply embedded in the specific context of a hot front in the Cold War. While hijackings elsewhere were often motivated by financial gain or political asylum, these were acts of state-sponsored aggression and propaganda. The lessons learned from the YS-11 and Fokker F27 hijackings therefore had a specific, urgent resonance for South Korea, forcing it to become a pioneer in aviation security. The nation learned the hard way that its civilian infrastructure was an extension of the battlefield and had to be defended as such. The armored cockpit doors and the Sky Marshal program were born from this harsh realization. These security measures, which seemed so drastic in the early 1970s, have since become the global standard, particularly in the post-9/11 world. The idea of a fortified cockpit, and an armed, unseen presence on board, is now a fundamental pillar of international aviation security. In this respect, South Korea's painful experiences served as a grim foreshadowing of the threats that the rest of the world would eventually face. The lessons learned on the Korean Peninsula that determined attackers will use violence to overcome passive defenses, and that the cockpit must be an impregnable fortress have been etched in steel and policy across the globe. The legacy of these two flights is in part written into the very design of the planes we fly in today. Reflecting on these events from the vantage point of 2024, they feel like relics from a different, more volatile time, yet the core tensions that produced them remain startlingly relevant. The Korean Peninsula is still technically at war, divided by the same hostile border. North Korea remains an isolated and unpredictable state, and the pain of separated families continues to be a raw, open wound. While the specific tactic of hijacking planes to the north has faded into history, the potential for provocation and the use of civilians as pawns has not. The stories of these hijackings are a crucial reminder that for South Korea, the conflict is not an abstract historical event, but a living, breathing reality that shapes its present and future. In conclusion, the hijackings that North Korea wants the world to forget must be remembered. They must be remembered for the courage of crews like that of the Fokker F27 and the sacrifice of heroes like co-pilot Jang Myung-se. They must be remembered for the enduring sorrow of the 11 unreturned abductees of the YS-11 and their families, who represent a national tragedy. And they must be remembered as a chilling lesson in the power of propaganda and the brutal realities of a conflict where human lives are secondary to political goals. These stories are more than just thrilling tales of aerial drama. They are essential chapters in the ongoing history of the Korean Peninsula, testaments to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable terror, and the enduring hope for a day when the skies and the land below are no longer divided.